Despite the sincerity of my belief that the older appearance of the characters and actors in this spin-off prequel is not an appropriate basis for any criticism, I know I'm going to be fighting a losing battle, hence the use of the word shouldn't rather than doesn't in the title. We're somewhat doomed to fixate on what are the clearest indicators of our mortality after all: the crow's feet, the weight gain, the grey hairs and their eventual loss, the weird bulging veins, the all too optimistic sagging of our skin, and the many winters besieging our brows, digging deep trenches in our beauty's fields. It's a natural consequence of the human condition to be preoccupied with them. That same preoccupation is appropriately enough explored in the series in question to various degrees. I should also state that I know that this attitude isn't exactly endemic in the fandom, and it's not often mentioned as a major issue. In fact, I often find the sentiment from those that do express the opinion that older appearances present an immersion problem that it's one of the very few issues with the show. So though I may begrudge the minor trend of fixation upon natural symptoms of aging in this case, I wouldn't go so far as to call it completely unreasonable, just that it's silly. But it just won't quite do to say that everyone should simply suspend their disbelief. That is unfortunately something of a platitude. What does it even entail, and why should it be practiced during the consumption of this show and others of similar circumstance? I don't have definitive answers, but I can at least elaborate for about 10 minutes because I think that the older appearance of the characters from Breaking Bad in its prequel Better Call Saul shouldn't matter at all. So there seem to be dimensions to the overall opinion that the immersion suffers because of the presence of physical symptoms of aging. One of them seems to express that the symptoms are so overt that they're distracting in themselves. I thankfully see this far less so than the other dimension most of this video is concerned with, but it's still somewhat there in sentiment arguably, and this is that those symptoms have a negative effect on the continuity of the entire Breaking Bad franchise. It's definitely a less shallow perspective, but still hardly worth putting your Wellingtons on for. So, shall we start with the point so obvious that I'm probably doing your intelligence a discredit by even bothering to articulate it? Let's take just one example. Jonathan Banks as Mike. A rather extreme example maybe, considering both the actor and the character's advanced age relative to the majority of the major cast, but no less relevant to the overall point. He indeed looks and sounds older in Better Call Saul than he does in Breaking Bad. That'd be because the former was produced after the latter. Roughly 4 years had passed between Jonathan Banks appearing as Mike in Breaking Bad and their first appearance in Better Call Saul. Banks got older then, and he got older when further seasons of the show, which at the time of recording depict 2 fictional years, were produced over another 7 actual years. And here's a reality check.
Some tough love, all right? Ready for this? Here goes.
The entire population of the planet, including you, got older too.
Now that's a hard motherfucking fact of life. But that's a fact of life your ass is gonna have to get realistic about.
No diet or health regime stops the process fully. So, if you're going to make the case that the actors undertaking more cardio and a paleo diet during the entire period of the show's production may have helped matters where continuity is concerned, I will ask you in turn to shove that salad where the sun doesn't shine. It's a deal you have to accept in reality, so why let it even infringe on your enjoyment of a piece of fiction when its effect on flesh and blood actors is literally, irrefutably, realistically irreversible? At the time of writing anyway. And do I really need to say it? Most of the cast wasn't, from the very start, exactly within a certain bracket of lifespan that affords the practice of disbelief suspension more lenience where playing age is concerned. That was a long sentence. At a certain point, despite both our reasonable and vain attempts to express otherwise, we all look our age. Regardless, attempts are certainly made to craft the illusion of the events happening during pre-Breaking Bad days. Makeup and choice lighting are certainly utilised where they can be, since these are the primary practical effects within the show's means that can be used to mitigate these oh-so-powerful distractions. But you and I both know that they can only do so much to fully convince anyone that a handful of real years didn't literally pass. You might very well argue that one of the fundamental objectives of any work of fiction is to do everything it can to convince its audience of the reality of what is being presented. So, pointing out the discrepancy of older appearance in a prequel is at least valid. Valid? Maybe. Unfair? Undoubtedly. Series of television take a considerable time to produce, and this, alongside both the fact that the show's major cast features mostly middle-aged actors and the restricted time period that the story calls for, means that the inevitability of aging's effect on physical appearance was bound to be incidentally showcased. If you want de-aging CGI to be utilised in service of that aforementioned objective, you're watching the wrong show. You want it for the wrong show. It doesn't have Disney Plus and Star Wars and Marvel series level of monetary investment and resource. And though you and I can definitely argue that it deserves to, I can also argue that it doesn't need it, and it certainly shouldn't be expected to utilize de-aging technology as standard production practice. Not only is it plainly expensive and a pain from a logistical standpoint, but it's also unsuccessful in its objective in the eyes of many, including me. In most cases of de-aging technology, I still see a highly synthetic attempt at rendering a youthful version of the face it's been applied to. I see an overly enthusiastic plastic smoothing over of the natural character of a face. It's not a younger face, it's digital makeup. But this isn't even the main reason why I believe that Better Call Saul doesn't need this degree of post-production treatment. That's the core of my next point, which essentially involves the adoption of an attitude and a perspective. Leave it at the cost of practically nothing, take it at the small expense of affording a little more dignity and respect to the talent and the fiction itself. A complicated thing to ask for on the internet, I'm aware. You probably don't need me to tell you that it's not the power of an original piece of writing, nor the absolute competence of its craft that guarantees its full production. The entire industry concerning what is made and what isn't is highly dependent on star power, trends, various legalities concerning these, and the interplay between them. You're more likely to want to see a bit of contemporary theatre if Anna Taylor-Joy is in it. You very rarely have popular and successful drama come to the fullest extent of production and realisation without the involvement of established and bankable stars, production staff, and/or characters. Most people wouldn't be interested in viewing the work otherwise, and pieces wouldn't exist in their intended and most popular form of consumption without them. But the core component always exists without them. The art that star power, those actors, are in essence facilitating. The reasons for the emotional responses you took to this television show primarily, whether you knew it or not. The story and the drama. These can be engaged with by talent of any age, and it's these that require the bulk of your creative, emotional energies, as well as your general intelligence as a viewer. For what is Better Call Saul on an essential level? A series of teleplays which engage with dramatic ideas concerning, and which are certainly not limited to, the incompatibility of personal integrity with highly hegemonic ideas of success, the destructive force of ruthless ambition, the complex process and consequences of traumatic stress and its repression, as well as those of depression, and the corruption of the human soul by the, unfortunately, necessary pursuit of the dollar. This is why we're engaged. This is what was intended to be explored and showcased by the creators and writers through their craft. The actors are a fundamental component in theatrically realizing that intent, but they're not the core of the emotional power of these concepts, which I realize sounds sacrilegious when we're considering a franchise which has become iconic for its body of masterful, intelligent, and often understated performances, but hear me out. Of course, this is all an elaborate way of saying that overt symptoms of aging are irrelevant next to the greater picture. What is impervious to physical degradation, and where the magic originates, is in the content and premise of the drama. Performers can bring these elements to theatrical realization, but they can't be physically remolded by the writers, nor indeed can they reverse time. They are employed to rigorously investigate their characters and the story, and give subsequent life to the dialogue which is significant of what the drama intends to explore. What matters in this context is how they go about doing that, not how they look physically in regard to a chronology and continuity that, for reasons we've discussed already, can't be perfectly realised, but it definitely can be adequately realised at worst. And what's wrong with a very minor component of televised fiction being adequate? The actor's part in the convincing of the audience can only be engaged with as far as their skill and competence allows. What obviously isn't in their power in that regard is the ability to take a few years off their face. It's the premise, ideas, and arguments inherent in the drama that engages your emotional intelligence and attention, and are what the performers, older than their characters or not, work toward realizing. Their exterior appearance in terms of physical age is academic in respect of this, unless the plot calls for particular attention to the age of the characters. And Better Call Saul doesn't call for attention to the exact age of the characters because it's irrelevant. This dimension is deliberately made slightly ambiguous where the major cast are concerned, and that is no doubt part of the effort to make it seem as if it's all taking place pre-Breaking Bad. It's also academic in respect of Better Call Saul's nature as I already mentioned, essentially a series of plays. The clue as to what is required of everyone involved in every aspect of a play is in the name. Were you distracted by the fact that your friend didn't in fact look like a chiseled and bearded 30-something warrior when you played fantasy together when you were young? No. You both implicitly agreed to maintain the illusion together because that's what playing requires, crossing over a threshold of sorts and agreeing to pretend because it's really fun. Televised fiction essentially asks the same thing of all parties. It's just far more impersonal and formal and mostly operates via a series of conventions and rules which, depending on genre and mode, tend to respect natural laws of reality. Which is why I feel that I should say that disbelief suspension certainly can't be depended on to dispute the validity of all criticism. I'm not out here saying that every discrepancy, lack of authenticity, plot hole, inconsistency, contrivance, or inaccuracy in fiction can be solved with a little disbelief suspension, just that it is, if not required and expected of the audience, then fair to ask of them where this particular topic is concerned. Ultimately, the apparent age of the actors is a purely cosmetic matter. To this end, to those distracted by aging and the continuity discrepancies it causes, I'd encourage altering their concept of what the actor is for. Think of them as important tools in service to something far more fundamental to a viewing experience than continuity. However, no tool is absolutely perfect, and indeed, neither is the illusion of the moving image. It'll only engage and fool you as much as you allow it to, essentially, and there's the rub. In any case, you're doing the art a disservice by pointing out and being distracted by the inevitability of gravity and time's effect on its subject's physical appearance and health.
That's not real.
And this isn't to say that adopting this perspective should stop you at least considering actors looking different than they quote-unquote should ever again. It's only natural, as I said at the beginning. And of course, an actor in their mid-40s portraying a high schooler is certainly pushing things in this regard. Not only should the audience suspend their disbelief, the production staff should also respect the limits of that suspension, and thereby respect the art of the illusion. But ultimately, if you want the actors you love portraying slightly younger versions of their characters in projects of a certain nature, and that are being made multiple years after the originals, you need to accommodate for the discrepancies we've been talking about. This is a perspective that is both more accommodating and respectful of the fiction and performances you chose to engage with. Ask yourself what you're at least partially contributing to through your focus on how old or how much older these actors are in regard to a literally impossible to perfectly maintain continuity, and one of the answers might just be a toxic culture which propagates youth and therefore ultimately extraordinary and unrealistic standards of beauty as greater units of value than anything else. Thank goodness these attitudes and focuses we've been discussing are neither more widespread or taken too seriously by the stakeholders at AMC. Imagine if they were. Imagine if they heavily factored into the decision as to whether the show was greenlighted. Sorry lads, they're just too much older than they were a few years ago for enough people to ignore it. We're done here.
We're done. When I say we're done.
We'd be without an authentic crime drama that deeply touches and brings people together because of superficiality. And if there's anything that I think unites fans in regard to their overall taste for the Breaking Bad franchise, it's a certain rejection of the superficial. Not that it's completely lacking in any superficiality. The older talent of Better Call Saul and El Camino, as all the points raised here apply to similar conversations surrounding that satisfying denouement as well, is still fundamentally the same talent of Breaking Bad. Regardless of its age and appearance, the talent portrays the characters as if they were real people. The talent brings the drama to conventional realization. That talent does everything it can within the means of its expertise to engage with our emotion and our intelligence and our hearts. The talent is what matters. But on a certain level, texts are very much a matter of co-construction. Thus, the art of the illusion and the immersion is always partly in the hands of the audience. Don't let the incidental effects of tough reality distract you too much, because there's little that can be done, and less that perhaps has to be done in respect of the art.